Hello, I'm Mukhar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The situation, of course, across the occupied territories remains quite fluid, and a lot of those harrowing images coming out of Israeli strikes on Gaza residential towers, more specifically, as well as other important infrastructure and buildings within that coastal enclave are coming out and continue to come out even throughout today and last night. And we've, of course, have the focus on the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, which was at the root, seemingly, of course, and I know that we can possibly point out a lot of root causes of what we're seeing playing out right now across the occupied territories, but one of the root causes of this latest bout of Israeli violence is the expulsion, or the attempted expulsion at least, of some Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. We also, of course, then have the situation at the Al-Aqsa Mosque as well. Eid prayers did take place there, seemingly in a peaceful atmosphere, at least from the images that I've seen. On top of that, then there is the international community's response, or if we're completely honest, lack of. I mean, we've had a lot of statements coming out, but very little to no action really on the part of anybody, especially those who are Israel's allies. I believe that there is a U.S. official who is set to be traveling to Israel to meet with Israeli as well as Palestinian leaders to try to diffuse these tensions. But the statements that have come out do not give much hope towards a neutral stance on the part of the United States or really any of Israel's allies at this time. Seemingly, with a lot of the statements that I've seen, there isn't even really a mention of Palestinians and Palestine at all, which again, as I said, doesn't give one much optimism and hope. Let's discuss all those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Ciaran Browne, who is an assistant professor at the School of Religion and Humanities at Trinity College, Dublin. He's joining us today from Belfast. Joining us from Birmingham is Kamel, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And joining us from Jerusalem is Dr. Toufic, Haddad, who directs a British Research Institute. He's also author of Palestine Limited, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territories. He lives, importantly, and this is an important detail, in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Brendan, Toufic, and Kamel, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Toufic, let me start with you. What is the latest around you in Sheikh Jarrah? There were videos posted on social media, on Twitter and elsewhere last night of Mohammed al-Kurd, who was, I believe now, it may be correct to say, was a resident of Sheikh Jarrah as well, being expelled from his home. What more can you tell us about what's happening around you and the mood in the air?
Thank you, Waqar, and Eid Mubarak to all the listeners. It's kind of difficult to explain the situation in Sheikh Jarrah. For the past 40 days, we have been basically in an escalating situation of almost complete havoc. It's difficult to describe. As everyone knows, these events have been precipitated by the final eviction notices that were issued to the 4 families. These are refugees' families in occupied land that are being expelled under dubious legal circumstances, to basically create a wedge, a west to east wedge around what is known as the Holy Basin. This is part of an Israeli settler plan to create 3 different sets of concentric circles around East Jerusalem, cutting these, essentially ghettoizing Palestinians in these areas, and particularly cutting off all the holy areas from their natural Arab periphery. The streets of Sheikh Jarrah have been witnessing for the past 40 days constant demonstrations, day and night, attacks from settler groups which enter not too far from where this interview is taking place. They smash cars, they harass the residents on the street. There has also been a very important sort of outpouring and self-mobilization, of course, the local community, attempting to defy these efforts to resist the attempted evictions. We see, a lot of outpouring of support around Sheikh Jarrah from all parts of society. We see 48 Palestinians coming in. We see some Israeli leftist Jews, however, not too many. And the Israelis have actually closed off the main road where the evictions are slated to take place. The streets of Sheikh Jarrah stink of what they call the stink water, because they have this water cannon that comes around and sprays all over the neighborhood. Yeah. Obviously, the high presence of Israeli military as well as cavalry. The explosions are heard all throughout the night. Rubber bullets, etc. So this is just a small picture. We haven't had much sleep here in Sheikh Jarrah. It is a constant and feeling of uncertainty and unpredictability. And there's also an element of it that I want to point out, is that sort of a very sort of attempt at humiliation and triumphalism on behalf of the settlers. If we had done this interview last night, you would probably I've heard for 2 hours the settlers blaring very loud triumphalist Zionist music just across the neighborhood, just as a way to sort of stick it in Palestinian faces that we are here, we're here to stay, we're not going to move, we're going to expand, and you're going to be expelled.
Kamel, as Toufic that we're speaking, I remembered that I just saw a video before coming on air of a family's home, I believe, in which, if I'm not mistaken, settlers were trying to storm it, and I'm sure you've seen that video as well. Again, disturbing images, because you also then put that in conjunction with what we've seen play out at Al-Aqsa and then what's been happening in Gaza as well. What are your thoughts about where the situation stands right now?
First of all, let me say that one of the families in Sheikh Jarrah, very much at the entrance, which Toufic has just described, is my one of my cousin's families, the Atiyah family, and they are really at the entrance point there, and their house has been turned into an open house for anyone who's come to show solidarity, to get tea, coffee, so I've been in touch with them on a regular basis, and people forget in the West when they see a snippet on the news that this is a 24/7 existence. The families are just simply trying to assert their right to their homes. They're the homes that were given to them, for which they gave up their, if you like, status almost as a refugee. And now the settlers still want to throw them out in a blatant act of ethnic cleansing. The circles that Toufic referred to are, that's what they're doing. They're expanding them through evicting Palestinians and replacing them with settlers. And many of them, as people will hear, have very much American New York accents. So that is one thing. But I think the key to this is that it was the Sheikh Jarrah resistance, which was started by a group of young people. That's really important too, who were facing eviction, who introduced the Save Sheikh Jarrah hashtag and began a campaign. And people like Muhammad al-Kurd, whose family is one of the ones in the firing line now in terms of being evicted, have done a really great job in bringing this to the fore. But bringing that to the fore eventually exposed this fact, that Israel was created, Zionism forced the creation of Israel onto the Palestinian people in their homeland. If you watch the faces of the security forces at Bab al-Amud, at Damascus Gate, as they had to dismantle the barriers they put up, and the Palestinians were mocking them, and it was clear who the people of the land were. It was the Palestinians, and they were facing this occupying power, which only maintains itself by the power of the gun. And now that's extended beyond Jerusalem to the 1948 areas, where there's been a coming together of the Palestinian people for the first time, I have to say, in this significant way, and during the week of the Nakba, to exemplify the fact that the Palestinians are one people. This is the Palestinian homeland, and the Palestinians have really ignited this quest for being united as a Palestinians and to get rid of the idea of Zionism, that you can throw a whole people out so that another group of aliens can come in and take it over.
Brendan, as somebody who is an expert in conflict resolution yourself, I wonder from the outside in then, how do you view the situation on the part of the international community and its response or lack of, as I had mentioned in my introduction? I mean, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's just the Republic of Ireland or some officials there who have possibly, released sensible statements, if I may use that term loosely right now. But a lot of the rest of Israel's allies, specifically, I'm talking about now the likes of the UK, United States and others, have released statements which are very much one-sided, and yet they keep saying that they are in fact neutral players. Especially the United States keeps insisting that it is in fact the only mediator, quote unquote, towards any peace between Israelis and Palestinians. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I send my best wishes and solidarity and to all my friends in Palestine and Toufic in Sheikh Jarrah. I've spent a lot of time in Jerusalem and across the West Bank. Well, I mean, I'm not in any way surprised at the international community's response here. This is standard practice for the international community, failing utterly to condemn the actions of Israel when it comes to their ongoing attempt at settler colonial erasure. And you referenced Ireland there. Ireland holds at this moment in time an important seat on the Security Council, and should really be doing more when it comes to highlighting the deep asymmetry and inequality of the situation on the ground. And I'm not necessarily sure I would agree with you when it comes to Ireland being a strong voice. I mean, the first thing that Simon Coveney did say, as Ireland's representative, was to condemn rocket fire out of Gaza before he condemned any actions on the Israeli side. So I think we need to be really careful when it comes to language, because language is being very clearly distorted when it comes to the situation on the ground. And as your two previous guests have mentioned already, it's very clear that what's happening here is part of a wider attempt at removing a Palestinian presence. And that's absolutely unacceptable and must be condemned in the strongest terms. The international community does have a role to play, must stand up and speak out against this. And I don't think it does that anywhere near strong enough.
You know, Toufic, the Jordanians as well, there was that meeting between Blinken and the Jordanian official in D.C. not too long ago, and there was that statement on the part of the Jordanian Prime Minister, if I'm not mistaken, or Foreign Minister, and he had mentioned, the fact that essentially this is the red lines have been crossed vis-a-vis Al-Aqsa, etc. But it seems that even within the region, I'm speaking more about those countries that at this point in time have relations with Israel, even those Arab countries that have normalized ties under the Abraham Accords, that their hands seem to be tied, or they just seem to be quite muted in their response. And I'm specifically then talking about the likes of the UAE, even though I believe Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai did release some sort of a statement. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, to be frank, I see all those countries as kind of part and parcel of the same sort of network of falling beneath sort of a kind of pro-US, pro-Western approach to what happens here. And if I might sort of add on to what Brendan was saying regarding the situation, I think everything that we're witnessing here today has to do with the complete failure of and the false logic which was part of the peace process. The international community has not been engaged in a serious peace process. They've been engaged in a conflict management situation, which basically means that Israel was able to pocket huge gains through the peace process, entrench itself, expand its colonial presence there, and then expect to sort of manage the situation by throwing out a bunch of money and a bunch of sort of weak statements every time the conflict continues to regenerate itself and explode in situations like this. And now it's all falling apart. They created open space for Israel to run towards the finish line, and for Israel to allow this extremist Jewish supremacist approach to irrigate it across the political spectrum within Israel. And that's why the situation has also expanded into 48 Palestine, and the entire situation has collapsed. And we're also in a situation where also the Israelis themselves don't even have a clear governing situation, with Netanyahu not being able to form his government, and neither the other coalition. Yeah. The Arabs, we don't expect very much from them. I mean, they're on the firing line insofar as their contradictions are exposed, insofar as they claim to be protectors and supporters of Palestinians and the holy sites in Jerusalem. But in the end, they are allying themselves with the Israelis and the Americans, and they are the ones who are expected to pay the money that is thrown out for this conflict management situation that's essentially collapsed right now.
Kamel, if I may come back to just the Palestinians once again and the Palestinian leadership, Mahmoud Abbas made a statement as well. There's been a lot of criticism, as you well know, Kamel, and I'm sure you've heard of Mahmoud Abbas himself and his sort of, again, muted response, if I may use that term a bit loosely in this case, versus, of course, Hamas. And I don't want to get into a Fatah versus Hamas situation, but I'm just saying that on the part of the Palestinian leadership itself, do you think that there has been some failing? I am talking about the official leadership at this time.
I think Palestinians have been failed by leadership in Gaza, in the West Bank, and indeed in the 1948 areas, where the representatives of the Palestinian citizens of Israel have not played a good role in representing them and in keeping this connection between the Palestinian people as a whole, which is what this current, I call it an uprising. At one point, I was going to call it actually the smiley face uprising, because all you could see was Palestinians were being arrested, smiling as they were being arrested. But then it turned ugly, and it, as you know, it has turned deadly now with the war on Gaza. But unfortunately, there is a lack of leadership in all cases. And as you say, we don't want to get into whether the Hamas leadership in Gaza is better than the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, because, as I say, there's a failure here, particularly since they have not been able to heal the rift between the two parties. There should be a single strategy for Palestinian liberation with the leadership coming together. And this is why, and this is not a side issue, I'm involved in an initiative to rebuild the PLO. We need to go back to basics and to say we are one Palestinian people. Whether it's in Chile or Australia or in the Middle East or Europe, the Palestinians as a people should have representatives who then elect a new leadership that should take on the burdens that lie ahead, which are huge in terms of bringing us back to our liberation movement. And I think what is really different, and we commemorate the Nakba on Saturday, here in the UK we're going to have a massive march from Marble Arch to the Israeli embassy, in that people would be able to show their support for the Palestinians. We remember the Nakba, but this is different to any other commemoration I can remember, because of the fact that we're now talking about an uprising across the whole of historic Palestine.
Brendan, you know, I don't want to just look at the international community's response in negative terms. I mean, there does seem to be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, on this point, there does seem to be more awareness on the part of individual politicians, of course, across the Western world as well. So we have, for example, pockets of politicians within the United States who have released fairly sensible statements, in fact, talking about how Israel needs to stop, you know, for example, attacking Palestinians, attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque as people are praying, expelling Palestinians from their homes in occupied territories, etc. Does that sort of show a sign that ever so slowly, and we've talked about this probably before as well with other Palestinian experts, that the tide is in fact changing?
I mean, perhaps it could be. I mean, it's interesting you say that about there being greater awareness of the situation. I mean, I know Twitter is a bit of a vacuum at times, but you do see a rise in popular culture figures seemingly putting the case of Palestine or tweeting their support. I mean, there's a couple of pop stars here in Ireland called Jedward all of a sudden have released a statement about Palestine and put it on their Twitter feed. So it is amongst people's everyday discourse at the moment. And a lot of people, I'm using the case of Belfast, for example. Last night there was a large gathering of people in Belfast demonstrating their support. A rally that was called very last minute, and it attracted hundreds of people. So people are energized and very awakened to the situation. But it needs much more than that. It needs political leadership across the world to stop speaking out of both sides of their mouths, to use the language of what this really is, and to stop looking to place blame on all sides at all times. It's not acceptable. It doesn't wash with people anymore. And as Toufic and as Kamel have said, this is a moment of survival, and the international community really does need to step up to the plate and not just refer back to peace processes, inverted commas, that have been fundamentally flawed from the outset.
Toufic, I'll give you the final word as we're quickly running out of time before I let all three of you go. There's a lot of talk, Toufic, again online as well, about, Intifada, right? Are we heading that way? Is that where things are headed? Because, the situation in Gaza, especially, and of course, throughout the occupied territories, as we've all discussed, is pretty bad right now and fluid. But is that the way we're headed? Does it even matter if we call it that or not? But I mean, if that were to happen, then if we were to have an all-out uprising in that sense, what would that signal to happen next?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I can see the writing on the wall. I mean, whatever we call it, it's going. What's obvious is it's going to be bloody. We have to look at the vectors that are taking place on the ground. And on the Palestinian side, there's a strong sense of national identity and rights, and a sense of defiance and a willingness to resist. On the Israeli side, we have essentially an unhinged Jewish supremacist movement, both popular as well as governmental, that is going all out against the Palestinians. And on the international side, we have mealy-mouthed responses to this situation, which, because they don't want to change their position and to be exposed and to actually intervene, take a stand based on international principles and dignity. The situation here is very obvious. It's military occupation, it's apartheid. The international community and governments have known this for a long time, but they've been hiding behind it the whole time, behind buzzwords and peace and calling for both sides. The truth is they want an Israeli ally in this region because they are against democracy in this region. They are against Palestinian state. They support Israel for very clear imperial purposes in the region, and it serves that goal. So under that shelter, basically, Israel does what it wants to the Palestinians, and it needs to work to fragment them, and if need so, continue to ethnically cleanse them, to entrench what they call the Jewish state. We need to attack the basic principles that are taking place here, both Jewish supremacy and the concept of Zionism, which can only enforce itself through force and through ethnic cleansing here, and the Western umbrella that provides it that protection. And the only forces that can take on that are not going to be the governments and the different kinds of groups that are supporting it in the elite strata, but the popular movements that are on the ground, that are building up, that we are beginning to see and hear more and more of because of the larger crisis that is taking place around the world that we saw after 2007, also under COVID, basically attempting to take democracy back from the way it has been evacuated in the last few years because of so many different factors of how capital and has been able to concentrate so much power and evacuate democratic processes. We need to build movements from below that actually stop the mechanisms that make this work, and that's the only way I see it changing. How we label it is not an issue.
Indeed. Yeah, I do for coming in, Toufic. The clock has gotten the best of us, but I really appreciate Toufic, Kamel, and Brendan for their time today. Toufic joining us here from Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. He directs a British Research Institute and is an author. Kamel was joining us from Birmingham. He's the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and Brendan was joining us from Belfast. He is with the Centre of Resistance Studies at Trinity College Dublin and is a conflict resolution expert. We were discussing there the latest situation coming out of the occupied territories, throughout the occupied territories. This is not just limited to Gaza or Sheikh Jarrah or Al-Aqsa, but this is essentially throughout the occupied territories, as we would understand it. Different pockets of violence taking place at this point in time on the part of Israelis, and of course then retaliation from Palestinians. This latest bout of violence, as we discussed already, it's rooted seemingly in what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, but the root causes are a lot more deep than just what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. Gaza continues to be struck by the Israelis, and the Gazans themselves continue to retaliate as well through rockets into Israeli territories, or Israeli cities, I should say, as well. We'll keep a very close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to continue to discuss what's happening across the occupied territories, Palestine, but we're going to take another angle on this, and we've discussed this in the first half as well to an extent, and that is awareness about what's happening. And that, of course, a lot of that sort of information is being disseminated through social media. At the beginning of the issue that had erupted, and is still very much one of the root causes of this latest bout of violence, is what's happening in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and the likes of Instagram, even Twitter, started limiting posts and or completely deleting posts and blocking or suspending accounts online of those people who were trying to disseminate information about what's happening in that respective neighborhood, as well as throughout the occupied territories during this latest round of tensions. What does that say, about tech giants and their role overall when it comes to the issue of Palestine, as well as we can probably talk about other such issues as well? And overall, then, what does this say about awareness that is growing through, again, online mediums about this very issue? How important a role does that then play about how aware or not people are about what's really happening on the ground? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Jeremy Wildeman, who is a research fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. He's joining us this morning from Ottawa, Canada. Joining us from Exeter in the UK is Colter Louwerse, who is a PhD candidate of Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Colter and Jeremy, thank you both for your time today. Jeremy, I'd like to start with you. As I put in my introduction, there is seemingly, and I've spoken about this with other experts as well, seems to be greater awareness, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, about what's happening in Palestine. And I would imagine that a lot of that goes back to online posts. How important a role does that then play possibly in pressure upon respective governments and how they then react, such as, for example, the Canadian government?
And a fundamental shift in the case of Canada. We just saw yesterday, for the first time I know of, at least in the last 20 years, but for the so-called sort of left party that used to be a socialist party, the NDP in Canada, they actually criticized Trudeau's support of Israel and called yesterday for an arms embargo on Israel while the violence continues. And this is really a result of social media, because Canada has probably the most controlled media environment, conventional media environment among Western countries. You don't see really any stories getting through that are sympathetic to the Palestinians, particularly with the public broadcaster, the CBC, and then the private broadcasters tend always to have a very strong pro-Israel inclination. Pro-Israel as in certain sort of perspectives on Israel, of course, right? The more Netanyahu-friendly approach. You could say with tech giants, you have some similar problems the mainstream media has in North America. I'm just going to slide into that. That it's a lot of, you can think of it from a racial and identity perspective. It's still a very white environment. And I've heard in Canada that, as an example, with the public broadcaster, that staff of color worry that management that is very white has a biased perspective on Israel and Palestine. And you can see the same problems cropping up with the tech giants in Silicon Valley. That being said, social media has been the medium by which people have been getting their information in Canada in particular from Israel and Palestine.
Yeah. And Colter, what are your thoughts about the importance of then that sort of information being disseminated and the effect that it may be having?
Well, you'll recall that the current escalation is coming on the heels of two dovetailing human rights reports, one by the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem and another by the world's largest human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, impugning and copiously documenting Israel's commission of acts of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as with Israeli proper. And a group like Human Rights Watch is a rather mainstream centrist organization. They don't just go out on a limb like that without reason. And it's safe to say that a Human Rights Watch's report has the potential to both be productive of and a product, and already is a product of, public opinion in the West. And that is to say that now there's a growing number of Westerners who, when they look at a situation that's going on in Sheikh Jarrah, where, as Amnesty International reported, Israel went on what it called a rampage against largely peaceful demonstrators in Sheikh Jarrah who were opposing the ethnic cleansing, what Israel likes to call the eviction of Palestinians from their homes. Westerners are now more likely to look at a situation like that as it's streaming to them through social media platforms like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and to connect it to this broader overarching picture of Israeli domination and an effort to instantiate a regime of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea.
You know, Jeremy, there's also, and I don't want to get into just, talking about celebrities necessarily, but I would think that that's made a huge impact as well, right? We've had a number of Hollywood celebrities too, in fact, speaking about Palestine. Some of them have in the past as well, mind you, but we've had some who have remained silent in the past as well, sharing information about what's happening in the territories, sharing videos that are coming out. And a lot of those videos, again, as videos they're hard evidence of what is happening on the ground. Does that also, do you think, have an effect, especially in countries where celebrity culture is very much important?
It's a build-on effect, yes, and you see a major shift taking place in North America. The United States, I think, is a little bit more advanced than Canada. There's been more of a so-called safe space to speak about Palestine, particularly in the Democratic Party now, where you have such a large percentage of Democrats expressing sympathy for Palestinians, and a fairly large part of the Jewish community has shifted as well, which has made a major difference. There's a very active and strong Palestine presence in the United States, Palestinian community presence as well. You see that in Congress now even. Canada has been tougher until now. Maybe we'll see how this progresses. There's been no sort of political party that's been really welcome to Palestine supporters, similar to what you're seeing in the UK with the change of Keir Starmer. But yes, there's the celebrity endorsements are pretty unprecedented.
And so, Colter, would it be an overstatement to say that this may actually change things on the ground? Because for the Israelis in the past, too, their image has been important, especially in the way that the world views them, and especially online. And certainly there has been the other side as well. I mean, the other side has done its due diligence, if I may use that phrase, in trying to ensure that their point of view also is disseminated online. We've had, many videos of the rockets, for example, landing in Tel Aviv and or other places across Israeli cities. Does this in some ways then affect things on the ground, or is this just very limited to just this online space?
I think it does have an effect, and you're absolutely correct to say that Israel is trying very, very hard now to locate the origin of this latest round of escalation in the emergence of Hamas rockets from Gaza. But it's also safe to say that increasingly people are recognizing that this simply isn't the case. What is Gaza? Gaza is, in the words of the UN Human Rights Chief in 2018, it's a toxic slum in which men, women, and children are caged from birth to death. It is, as that Human Rights Watch report I just mentioned aptly articulated, it is a place where every day a person is born into an open-air prison. 50% of the population is unemployed, 96% of the drinking water is unfit for human consumption. And as human rights organizations have copiously documented, the proximate cause of Gaza's misery is this unstinting 14-year-long illegal under international law Israeli blockade of Gaza. That really is where the latest round of escalations finds its origins, in addition to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And as the American public, as Jeremy correctly noted, especially within the Democratic Party, becomes increasingly aware of this reality, there also becomes the potential for increased pressure upon the U.S. government. Unfortunately, at the moment, not sufficient pressure to shift the Biden administration's position, which has echoed Israel's claims that it's simply defending itself, but nevertheless has amplified public pressure upon the U.S. government to take steps to reduce Israel's escalation against the people of Gaza and against the people of Palestine in general.
Jeremy, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. We're having this conversation, and these conversations are taking place online. These debates are taking place online at a time when we have the likes of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which a lot of groups, even some Jewish peace groups, have a problem with. There is then that danger, is there not, that everything then gets labeled anti-Semitic, which is then criticism of Israel. And I know that that's a debate which is heavily happening right now even. I mean, I'm looking at tweets right now where that's still very much happening, that even the sharing of videos, hard evidence, as I said, of what's happening is being called anti-Semitic.
Yeah, there's a real concern that you could see this controlled much like in a way, the social media is still a freer space than conventional media because everybody has access to it. And so it's taking it's a lot more effort to try and control it and shape narratives on social media. So the IHRA could have an impact, particularly when you think that tech giants are based in the United States. So legally and just from a social perspective, they're much more influenced by that debate and any restrictions that could come with it. That being said, to this point, social media is really the way that the message is getting about what's happening on the ground. And people communicating with family back home, and they share the images that they're seeing. And the images we're seeing within Israel are quite frightful now. And I think that's going to have a long-term impact. The mobs in the streets, the chants, this is really seared into people's minds more than the narrative that's being constructed here in the mainstream media in the West is as another Gaza conflict and Israel defending itself. But that street narrative that social media provides, which the IHA would have a tough time controlling, just people's experiences on the streets, that is going to be seared into people's minds.
Well, very well. We'll leave it there at that. The clock has gotten the best of us, and we really appreciate both Jeremy and Colter for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. We were talking there, again, about Palestine and what's happening across the occupied territories, but more from the perspective of what's happening in the online space and the kind of effect that is happening upon the awareness, A, of people around the world, and B, the conversations that people are then having, the questions that they're asking from their respective governments, many of them allied with the Israeli government. Online space was always meant to be a free exchange of ideas and not a space where certain ideas are meant to be limited and or suppressed. And the effort seemingly by the likes of Instagram and others to suppress, block, suspend certain accounts or posts because they were talking about what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah or across the occupied territories and other places, was one symbol of that entire possible effort to suppress those voices. Instagram has now said that was down to algorithms, but then that in and of itself then opens up another Pandora's box about why were its algorithms set up such to then be biased in a fashion to be against then Sheikh Jarrah posts. All of this is worrying, but at the same time there is hope because these conversations are taking place, because people are more aware. This then does show hope for more objective than opinions, really objective opinions about what's happening in the occupied territories, and then hopefully this is going to all result in a just resolution as well for all involved. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.